The thing I like best about the summer movie season is the widely agreed upon sentiment that it's where we can go for escapism, briefly leaving the often depressing and debilitating struggles of reality behind to indulge in flights of fancy about magic, superheroes, fantasy, fast cars, sexy spies, and police brutality as the ground-level manifestation of deeply ingrained systemic racism. Good times. Detroit is a fact-based procedural drama from Catherine Bigelow and Mark Bowl, late of The Hurt Locker and Zero Dark 30, focusing on the Algiers motel incident, an infamous night of race-related police brutality taking place in Detroit, Michigan in July of 1967 during a larger stretch of violent clashes between outraged civilians and the city's notoriously racism-infested police department known as the 12th Street Riots. The incident saw 9 people suffer brutal beatings and abuse attributed to a group of out-of-control police officers and resulted in at least 3 deaths, one of which has never been solved. This was always going to be a difficult movie to make, to watch, to review, to consider, just tough going all around. Not only are you grappling with the facts of the case, the socio-political ramifications of releasing a movie about police racism at a moment in time where American culture is wrestling with that issue perhaps as bitterly as ever, and the question of whether or not white Hollywood filmmakers, however respected or accomplished they may be, have the proper perspective to tell this story or even should be telling it to us in the first place. Now, the Bigelow and Bowl team have thus far specialized in procedural dramas set in volatile situations. And at first, that's immediately concerning, when you realize that means they're attempting to shoot a film about civil unrest in the fashion of a war movie, which, if not managed very carefully, has the potential to descend without even intending to into tacky both-sidesism, drawing some kind of imaginary balance between the beleaguered rioters and the brutal agents of the system they're standing up against in the first place. Now, fortunately, that turns out not to be the case. The initial after-hours party raid that sparked the days of rioting is depicted as a collision of police overreach and justifiable pent-up community aggression, and subsequent scenes of police mobilization and National Guard involvement paint an appropriately harrowing picture of matter-of-fact state violence against its own citizens, particularly in the contrast between law enforcement's near-constant overreaction to the supposed threat of sniper fire and the fact that it never seems like there are any snipers. All of that is just setup though, and eventually Detroit very quickly gets all the necessary players assembled at the Algiers motel for what turns out to be the film's main focus, an unflinching recreation of the known and reported details of the crime, followed by an equally methodical detailing of how the bad guys effectively got away with it. Which is not a spoiler, it's the point. And to be sure, all of this plays out with the kind of precise and detailed filmmaking you'd expect from this team. While we always understand what's happening, where everyone is, and what the literal and psychological geography of the landscape is, we're also constantly in touch with the confusion and horror that the actual characters attract in at the same time. Even though the narrative eventually centers on Algie Smith as a struggling musician and Will Poulter as the vengeful leader of the bad cops as the main avatars of the victims and the system, the other characters remain vividly, if a bit thinly sketched overall. The prolonged group torture and torment secret that makes up effectively the entire second act is white-knuckle stuff, and the more formal injustices that follow are outrageous and heartbreaking in their own right. And yet, it never feels exactly as personal and deeply affecting as its mournfully traumatized coda indicates it was meant to be. For a story that bills itself as a societal expose as much as a historical one, it's a strange lack of genuine feeling and insight beyond the obvious. It packs a punch, but it doesn't wound. It only bruises. The problem at the heart of it is that it doesn't really have much to say about its supposed subject matter of police racism and the ongoing abuse that comes from it beyond, this is a thing that exists, and it's bad. And while there's certainly nothing wrong with demonstrating an evil with the goal of informing an audience of its presence, it does demand the question of what that work has to offer to those for whom this exists is not in and of itself a fresh enough revelation to carry interest in an entire movie. And it also, yes, can't help but raise the question of whether or not it's appropriate to take hold and make use of the pain not only of specific individuals, but the generational and historic pain of an entire community to say little more than, this is bad. Don't you feel bad now knowing about this? And yeah, that comes with the additional question of whether or not white Hollywood filmmakers specifically should be the ones doing so in the first place. Now, I'm not qualified to answer that one, but I can tell you it would be a lot easier to dismiss as a question if the film overall didn't feel so surface level. In the end, it does end up feeling, intentionally or not, like the overall thrust of the film is aimed at, if not a quote-unquote white audience, at the very least an audience that's expecting to find the facts of police brutality and systemic racism so shocking and outrageous that the outrage becomes a point in its own right and thus won't see any issue with the surface-level proceduralism and lack of stabs at genuine character depth, or even extra insight. Now this sense, which again I don't see as any kind of indicator of malice or lack of empathy, extends all the way to the film's advertising, where the portentous tagline gravely intones, "Detroit, it's time we knew." And you just can't help but see it and think, movie? I'm pretty sure there's a whole big chunk of the audience looking at that saying, yeah, we already know. Still, however, I can't deny that the filmmaking is powerful and the performances are all extremely solid. And while it does indeed go not much deeper than presenting the outrages to be outraged by, it does so effectively, especially in a succession of small scenes where we witness people with the authority to stop or punish the violence ultimately decide it's somehow not worth their effort. Imagine that. There's not much there beyond the indictment, but the indictment does sting all the same, and that's not nothing. 2.5 stars. Also, yes, John Boyega is very good in this, but his character isn't actually as much of the story as you might think, so yeah.